I put my wife through medical school, while I worked 2 jobs, but then my wife left me. You won't believe what happened next. When my wife, the woman I gave everything to, made a choice that shattered my world, I was left holding the pieces. How did I turn that heartbreak into something powerful and life-changing? Stay with me, because this story ends in a way you'll never see coming. I still remember the exact moment. My life started falling apart. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a subtle change. Like the air in the room suddenly felt heavier. Alara was sitting at our tiny, second-hand kitchen table, her head bent low over a medical textbook, her pencil tapping against the page as she read. I'd come home late. Again. After a grueling 12-hour shift at the warehouse. My hands were calloused from lifting heavy crates. My back ached from endless hours of hard labor. And all I wanted was to feel her arms around me, to hear her voice telling me that what I was doing mattered. But that night, when I walked in, she barely looked up. She offered a faint, distracted smile and murmured something about having to study for an exam. I'd grown used to that smile. Used to hearing her talk about how hard medical school was. How important it was that she stayed on top of her coursework. But something in her tone was different that night, distant, almost cold. I brushed it off. She was stressed, I told myself. And so was I. But I kept going. I always kept going. Those early days had been hard, but they'd also been filled with hope. I'd met Alara when we were both struggling to make ends meet. She'd been this bright, ambitious woman with dreams as big as the Texas sky. And I'd fallen for her the moment I saw her. Her passion was infectious. I remember the way her eyes lit up when she talked about becoming a doctor, how she wanted to save lives, make a difference, and change the world. It wasn't just a career for her, it was a calling. And I wanted nothing more than to be the man who helped her reach that dream. So I worked. I worked harder than I ever thought possible. I took on double shifts, picked up weekend hours, anything to cover her tuition and the endless stream of medical supplies she needed. My clothes grew threadbare, my shoes wore out, and I lost count of the nights I came home so tired that I fell asleep on the couch without even making it to the bed. But I didn't care. I believed in her. I believed in us. Our apartment back then was barely livable. The walls were so thin I could hear our neighbors arguing at all hours of the night. And the plumbing was a joke every time we tried to run the shower. It made this awful screeching sound that echoed through the whole building. We had one tiny window in the kitchen that looked out over an alley filled with trash. And no matter how much we cleaned, the place never really felt clean. But it didn't matter. I didn't need a fancy apartment or a big house. All I needed was her. I loved the way she'd laugh at my dumb jokes, the way she'd light up when she talked about her classes. For a while, that was enough. I still remember the nights when she'd look up from her textbooks, her eyes soft and full of gratitude, and say, "You're working too hard, Luca. You need to rest." I'd smile, ruffle her hair, and tell her, "I'll rest when you're a doctor." And I meant it. I thought I could handle anything as long as it meant she'd achieve her dreams. But over time, those moments grew fewer and farther between. She stopped looking up when I came home, stopped asking about my day. I'd try to tell her about something funny that happened at work, but she'd just nod distractedly, her eyes never leaving the page. The little things that used to bring us closer, the shared meals, the late-night talks, the simple gestures of affection, they all started to fade. One morning, after another sleepless night, I found myself staring at the bathroom mirror, my reflection almost unrecognizable. Dark circles under my eyes, hair that desperately needed a cut, shoulders that slumped from years of hard labor. I barely looked like the man I used to be, the man Alara had fallen in love with. And for the first time, I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. Not in loving her, I'd never regret loving her, but in thinking that love alone was enough. I'd given everything I had, poured my heart and soul into supporting her, and yet it felt like I was slipping further and further away from her. Like the harder I worked, the more distant she became. I tried to talk to her about it one evening. We were sitting at that same old kitchen table, the one we'd picked up at a garage sale when we first moved in together. I told her I felt like we were drifting apart, that I missed the way we used to be. She looked up from her textbook, her expression unreadable, and said, "I'm just really busy, Luca. I have to focus on my studies. You understand, don't you?" I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. Of course, I understood. I always understood. But that didn't make it hurt any less. As the months went by, the distance between us only grew. She started staying out later, spending more time with her classmates and less time at home. The warm, loving woman I'd fallen in love with was replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone who seemed more interested in climbing the next rung on the ladder than in holding on to what we had. And yet, I kept going. I kept working those long hours, kept believing that once she graduated, things would get better. I held on to that hope with everything I had, even as the cracks in our relationship grew deeper and more impossible to ignore. Looking back, I think I knew even then that things were falling apart. But I couldn't let myself admit it, because admitting it would mean facing the possibility that I'd sacrificed all those years of my life for a dream that wasn't even mine. I didn't want to believe that the woman I loved could walk away after everything we'd been through. So I held on, hoping that somehow, some way, we could find our way back to each other. But the truth was, I was holding on to a memory, a version of her that no longer existed. And the harder I tried to cling to it, the more it slipped through my fingers. I started noticing the shift about a year into her third year of med school. It wasn't one big event, just little things that slowly added up until they were impossible to ignore. At first, it was small, like her stopping in the middle of a conversation and glancing at her phone when she got a notification. She'd always put her phone away before, even if it buzzed during one of our rare moments together. But now, she'd pick it up, check the screen, and give me a quick, dismissive, "Sorry, I need to answer this." I told myself it was normal. She was busy, stressed, trying to keep up with the demands of her classes. Who wouldn't be glued to their phone under that kind of pressure? But then she stopped putting her phone face up on the table, something she'd always done without a second thought. I remember coming home late one night and finding her sitting on the couch, her laptop open, a faint smile on her face. When she noticed me standing there, she quickly closed it and said she was just going over some notes for a study group. That was the first time I felt it, that sinking feeling in my stomach, like something was slipping through my fingers. Her study groups started lasting later and later. She used to be home by 9, maybe 10 at the latest. Now, midnight came and went, and I'd sit there staring at the door, listening for the sound of her key turning in the lock. I'd tell myself she was working hard, maybe staying behind to review extra material. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off. "You don't understand how intense it is, Luca," she'd say. "You think I'm just hanging out? I'm trying to make it through med school. Don't make me feel bad for doing what I have to do." I didn't push further. I never wanted to be that guy, the one who questioned everything, who made her feel like she was walking on eggshells. I wanted to be supportive. I wanted to be the man she could rely on, not the one who added more stress to her already full plate. So I let it go, even though that gnawing feeling in my gut never went away. Milo saw it before I did. He pulled me aside one morning when we were grabbing coffee before my shift. "Look, man," he said, his voice low so the barista wouldn't hear. "I don't know what's going on, but you need to keep an eye out. Not every woman remembers who stood by them when they're climbing to the top." I waved him off, laughed it off, just like I always did. "Alara's not like that," I said. "She's different. She appreciates everything I've done. She tells me all the time." Milo shrugged and took a sip of his coffee. "People change, Luca. They don't mean to, but they do. Just don't blind yourself, okay?" I nodded, but in the back of my mind, I thought he didn't know what he was talking about. Alara and I had been through too much together. We were solid. We were building something real. I couldn't let myself think otherwise. Not then. But then came the night I got home and found her already asleep in bed. That might sound normal to most people, but for us, it wasn't. We'd always waited up for each other. Even if she was tired, she'd be on the couch with her textbooks, fighting to stay awake until I walked through the door. But that night, she was out cold. Her phone sat face down on the nightstand, her laptop shut tight. I stood there for a moment, just staring at her. Something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew it was more than just exhaustion. I crawled into bed, careful not to wake her, and lay there listening to the sound of her breathing. It used to comfort me, used to make me feel at peace. But now, it just made me feel more alone. I started paying more attention after that. I noticed how she'd always have an excuse for why she couldn't have dinner with me. I have a late lab, she'd say. I need to study with a partner. There's this guest lecture I can't miss. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the way she avoided looking me in the eye, the way she kept her answers short and clipped, it all felt wrong. One night, I tried to surprise her by making dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread. I lit a candle, set the table, and texted her to see when she'd be home. She replied with one word, late. No explanation, no apology, just late. I stared at the text for what felt like hours, the candle burning down to a stub, the spaghetti going cold. When she finally came in, she barely noticed the table. "Oh, you made dinner?" she said, glancing at the cold plates. "I already ate at school. Sorry." She kissed me on the cheek, a quick peck that felt more like an obligation than affection, and disappeared into the bedroom. I sat at that table, staring at the half-burned candle and the untouched food, and wondered if she even remembered what we used to be. The more I tried to bring it up, the more she pulled away. "Can we talk?" I asked her one Sunday morning. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, still in her pajamas. She didn't even look up. "About what?" she said, her tone flat. "About us," I replied, feeling my chest tighten. She sighed and set her phone down. "Luca, I'm tired. I have so much on my plate right now. Can't we talk about this later?" I nodded, even though I knew later would never come. Later always meant never. And every time she said it, I felt a little piece of us slip further away. It wasn't just me who noticed. My sister, Angela, pulled me aside during a family barbecue. "Is everything okay with you and Alara?" she asked, her voice low so no one else could hear. I didn't know how to answer. "Yeah," I said. "She's just busy with school." Angela gave me that look, half skeptical, half concerned. "Just don't let her walk all over you, okay? You're a good guy, Luca. Don't let anyone forget that." I brushed her off, just like I'd done with Milo. "She's not walking all over me," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. "She's under a lot of pressure. It'll get better once she graduates." Angela didn't argue, but her eyes told me she wasn't buying it. As the months passed, the excuses piled up. Alara's once bright smile grew dim. Her laughter became rare, and the space between us felt like a canyon. I tried to hold on, tried to remind myself of all the good times we'd shared. But every time I reached for her, it felt like she was slipping further away. I'd see her standing in the kitchen, staring out that tiny window into the alley, and wonder what she was thinking about. Was she thinking about us? About our future? Or was she dreaming of something, or someone, else? I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were there. The way she kept her phone so close, the way she avoided my touch, the way she'd pull away when I tried to kiss her. It wasn't just stress, it wasn't just school. It was something more, something I couldn't ignore any longer. I told myself I needed to trust her, to give her the benefit of the doubt. But the doubt was there, growing bigger every day, and it was eating me alive. The breaking point came one night when I asked her if she wanted to go out for dinner. I hadn't seen her all week, and I thought maybe we could reconnect. Just the two of us. She didn't even hesitate. "I can't," she said, not looking up from her phone. "I have a meeting with my group." I nodded, trying not to let my disappointment show. But as she walked out the door, I felt something inside me shift. I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. I couldn't keep making excuses for her, for us. Something was wrong, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "Now that you've seen how it all started, tell me, what would you do next? Would you walk away and rebuild your life, or would you fight to get back? What was taken?" Comment 1 if you'd leave it all behind, or 2 if you'd stand your ground. Your choice could change everything. I remember the moment I finally realized something was seriously wrong. It was later than usual, and the apartment felt colder than it should have. I'd gotten off work a couple of hours earlier, a long shift at the warehouse that left my body aching and my mind buzzing. When I walked in, the lights were still on, and her laptop was open on the kitchen table. She was nowhere in sight. I set my keys down, the sound echoing too loudly in the empty space, and called out her name. "Alara?" No answer. I looked around, checked the bedroom, the bathroom, nothing. She wasn't home, and she hadn't mentioned going anywhere. My stomach turned. It wasn't like her to leave without telling me, at least not before all this started. I sat down at the table, staring at her laptop, the screen still glowing. For a moment, I debated whether I should look at it. It felt wrong, like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. But then I thought about all the nights she'd come home late without an explanation. All the times she'd brushed me off with vague excuses. Something wasn't adding up, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I don't know what I expected to find, but when I opened her laptop, my heart sank. The browser was still open, and there were messages. At first, I couldn't make sense of them, random names I didn't recognize. Conversations that seemed harmless at a glance. But as I read further, the words became clearer, more deliberate. It wasn't just casual chit-chat. These were long, detailed messages about their lives, their plans, their feelings. And one name kept coming up over and over again. Derek. My hands started to shake. I scrolled through the messages, each one hitting me like a punch to the gut. There were jokes I didn't understand, references to places she'd never mentioned to me. She talked about how stressful her classes were, how much she needed someone to lean on, and it wasn't me she was leaning on. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. But there it was, staring me in the face, undeniable and gut-wrenching. I sat back in the chair, staring at the screen as if it might suddenly erase itself. I wanted to close it, pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't. The words were burned into my brain. I felt like I was coming apart, like the ground beneath me had given way and I was falling, endlessly falling. All those nights I'd worked myself to the bone, all those mornings I'd woken up after just a few hours of sleep to do it all over again, they felt meaningless now. I'd done it all for her, for us, and she had turned to someone else. The man who had sacrificed everything for her wasn't enough anymore. The thought was suffocating. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to do anything to release the anger boiling inside me. But instead, I just sat there, frozen. After what felt like an eternity, I closed the laptop and sat in silence. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, bouncing between disbelief, anger, and sadness. I couldn't understand it. Had I been that blind? Had I missed all the signs? I'd thought I was being supportive, giving her the space she needed to succeed, but maybe I'd given her too much. Or maybe I'd never been what she wanted in the first place. The questions kept piling up, and I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, in this limbo where I was the only one still fighting for us. If she didn't want to be with me anymore, she needed to say it. I deserved that much, at least. When she finally came home, it was past midnight. I heard her keys jingling outside the door, and my heart leapt into my throat. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew I couldn't let it go. As soon as she walked in, she froze, surprised to see me sitting there in the kitchen. "Oh," she said, her voice strained. "You're still up." I stared at her, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Yeah," I said, "I wanted to talk to you." She hesitated, then set her bag down and sat across from me. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone cautious. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. I was angry, hurt, confused, but I didn't want to explode. I wanted the truth. "Where were you tonight?" I finally asked. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. "I was studying," she said quickly. "You know how busy I've been." I nodded, but my gut told me she wasn't being honest. "Studying where?" I pressed. She frowned, the faintest hint of frustration creeping into her voice. "At the library," she said. "I told you I had a late study group." I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing. "You didn't mention that earlier." She crossed her arms, her posture defensive now. "I thought I did. Look, I'm tired, Luca. Can we talk about this later?" Later. It was always later. I felt the anger rising again, but I pushed it down. "No," I said firmly. "We need to talk about it now." She looked at me, really looked at me, and for a moment, I thought she might tell me the truth. But then she shook her head and stood up. "I'm going to bed," she said. "We'll talk in the morning." And just like that, she walked away. I sat there, staring at the empty chair where she'd been, and felt the last remnants of hope drain out of me. If she couldn't even have an honest conversation with me, what was left? I felt like I was drowning, trapped in a relationship that no longer existed. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to let go. I still loved her, despite everything. I loved her. But love wasn't enough anymore. Something had to give. And deep down, I knew it would have to be me. I couldn't let go of what I saw on her laptop. Those messages haunted me every single day, gnawing away at the last threads of trust I was clinging to. I'd scroll through my phone at work, reading old texts we'd sent each other back when everything felt so simple. Back then, I'd work my double shifts and come home exhausted, but I never doubted that it was all worth it. I'd see her face light up when I walked in the door, and her smile was like a shot of adrenaline. She'd wrap her arms around me, and in those moments, all the fatigue in my bones didn't matter. But now, every time my phone buzzed, I felt that same shot, but it wasn't adrenaline. It was dread. I'd glance at her name on the screen, wondering if this would be the text that would confirm everything. Running late again. Study group is going longer than I thought. The excuses piled up, each one cutting deeper than the last. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth. I told myself I wasn't going to bring it up again. I'd tried that already, and it always ended with her brushing me off or shutting down the conversation. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. I waited until she left for her so-called study group, and gave her a 10-minute head start. Then I grabbed my coat, slipped out the door, and drove in the same direction I'd seen her head in so many times before. My palms were sweaty, and my heart was racing like I was back in high school sneaking out past curfew. But this wasn't teenage rebellion. This was my life. This was my marriage, our future on the line. She didn't go to the library. I knew where the library was. I'd dropped her off there enough times in the past. But tonight, she made a sharp right turn at an intersection that led to a part of town we rarely visited. The streets were quieter, lined with older brick buildings that cast long shadows under the streetlights. I hung back, my headlights dimmed, my hands gripping the wheel tight enough that my knuckles turned white. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe. It wasn't anything fancy, just one of those little places that stayed open late, with a neon sign that buzzed faintly. I parked a block away, turned off the engine, and waited. It wasn't long before I saw him. A man stepped out of a car a few spots down from hers. He was tall, well-dressed, clearly not a college kid pulling all-nighters in the library. He walked straight toward the cafe, and a moment later, I saw Alara get out of her car and meet him at the door. They didn't hug, but the way they stood close, the way she tilted her head slightly as she spoke to him, it was intimate. Too intimate. I felt my stomach churn, like someone had reached inside and twisted my insides into knots. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a classmate. Maybe they were working on a project together. But deep down, I knew better. The way she leaned in, the way she laughed softly, almost nervously, it wasn't the way you acted with a study partner. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, watching them through the cafe's window. They sat across from each other at a small table, their heads bent close as they talked. Every so often, Alara would glance toward the window, and I'd duck down, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't believe this was happening. I couldn't believe I was that guy, the one sitting in his car, spying on his own wife because he couldn't trust her anymore. But what choice did I have? She'd left me no choice. She'd shut me out, kept me in the dark, and now here I was, piecing together the truth on my own. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time seemed to stretch and blur. I watched them laugh, watched her smile in a way I hadn't seen in months. She looked happy, relaxed, like she was finally free of whatever had been weighing her down. But instead of feeling relieved, I felt like I was being crushed. I wanted to march in there, slam my hands on their table, and demand answers. But I didn't. I just sat there, letting the pain seep into every corner of my mind. When they finally stood up to leave, I felt a jolt of panic. What was I going to do? Follow them again? Confront her the moment she got home? I didn't have a plan. I never thought it would go this far. I never thought she'd actually give me a reason to follow her in the first place. As they walked out of the cafe, I saw the man place his hand lightly on her back, guiding her toward the parking lot. That small, familiar gesture, the kind of thing I used to do, felt like the final nail in the coffin. I didn't need to hear the words. I didn't need a confession. I'd seen enough. I drove home in silence, my mind racing. By the time I pulled into our driveway, it was well past midnight. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the faint light glowing through our apartment window. How was I supposed to face her after this? What was I supposed to say? I'd never felt so powerless. I wanted to yell, to cry, to demand answers, but I knew that wouldn't change anything. I climbed out of the car, trudged up the stairs, and let myself in quietly. The apartment was dark, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stood there in the living room, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I couldn't lift. I felt like a stranger in my own home. When she came through the door a few minutes later, I was sitting on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen. She stopped in the doorway, her keys dangling from her fingers, and looked at me. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. I nodded but didn't say anything. She hesitated, then moved toward the bedroom. "I'm really tired, Luca. Can we talk tomorrow?" It was the same line she always used, just another delay, another excuse. I wanted to call her out right then and there. I wanted to tell her that I knew she hadn't been at the library, that I'd seen everything. But the words wouldn't come. I felt frozen, like if I said it out loud, it would make everything real. So I let her walk away again, disappearing into the bedroom and shutting the door behind her. I sat there for hours, replaying the night in my head. The cafe, the man, the way she smiled at him, it all burned in my mind, clear as day. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had to change. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Couldn't keep holding on to the hope that this was all just a misunderstanding. The woman I loved was slipping away from me, and if I didn't do something soon, I'd lose her for good. But what could I do? What could I possibly say or do to fix this, when it felt like she didn't want to be fixed? I didn't have any answers that night. All I had was the crushing weight of knowing the truth, and the fear of what it meant for our future. By the time she'd walked into the bedroom that night, the weight of everything I'd seen was pressing down on me, suffocating me. My mind kept racing, jumping from anger to confusion to a kind of dull, aching pain that just wouldn't go away. I wanted answers, but more than that, I wanted the truth unvarnished, unfiltered. No more excuses. For too long, I'd been living in the shadow of her ambitions, believing that my sacrifices were building something real, something lasting. But now, all I could see were the cracks, the growing distance between us, and the bitter realization that I might never be able to fix it. I sat up late that night, long after Alara had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece it all together. The messages, the cafe, the way she had smiled at him, every detail was burned into my memory, looping over and over. I felt like a fool. Had I been blind all along? Was I just the guy she leaned on until someone better came along? My chest tightened at the thought. I hated feeling this way, helpless, used, discarded. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't deny what I had seen. She hadn't gone to the library. She hadn't been working late. She had chosen to spend time with someone else, and that choice had shattered something inside me. When I finally dragged myself into the bedroom, she was already asleep, or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a moment, staring at her silhouette under the blankets. She looked peaceful, like nothing was wrong. Part of me wanted to shake her awake, to demand answers right then and there. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, couldn't bring myself to do it. I turned away and lay down on the couch in the living room instead. I couldn't sleep beside her, not after what I'd seen. Not when I didn't know what the truth was anymore. The days that followed were like walking through a fog. I went to work, punched in, punched out, and barely heard a word anyone said. My coworkers noticed. Milo even pulled me aside at one point and asked if I was all right. "You look like hell," he said, his brow furrowed in concern. I just shrugged. "Long nights," I mumbled. He gave me a look that said he didn't believe me, but he didn't push. Milo wasn't the kind of guy to pry unless you invited him in. But I could tell he knew something was off. At home, things were tense. Alara and I spoke less and less, our conversations reduced to short, clipped sentences. She seemed distracted, distant. I tried to bring it up once, but she shut me down before I could get the words out. "I'm just busy," she said, her tone sharp, almost irritated. "You don't need to worry so much." I wanted to yell, to tell her that I had every reason to worry. But the words stuck in my throat. What would it solve? Another argument? Another night of her shutting me out? I couldn't take that again. I just wanted things to go back to the way they used to be before the lies, before the distance. But I knew deep down that those days were gone. I started coming home later, finding excuses to stay out. I'd sit in my car after my shift, staring at the dashboard, trying to summon the courage to go inside. Sometimes I'd drive around aimlessly, circling the city until the streets were empty and the neon signs started to flicker off. It was easier than facing her, easier than sitting in that apartment feeling the cold, invisible wall that had grown between us. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, that she'd snap out of it and we'd find our way back to each other. But each day that passed chipped away at that hope a little more. One evening, I walked in to find her on the phone, her back to me. She didn't hear me come in, so I stood there for a moment, listening. Her voice was low, hushed, and she was laughing softly, too softly. It was the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in months. My chest tightened, and I felt my fists clench at my sides. I cleared my throat, and she turned around, startled. "Oh, you're home," she said, quickly hanging up. Her cheeks were flushed, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. I didn't say anything, just stared at her until the silence grew uncomfortable. "It was just a friend," she said. Finally, her voice defensive. "I was talking to a friend from class." I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak. I wanted to believe her, but every instinct I had was screaming that she wasn't telling the truth. As the weeks dragged on, I found myself pulling further away. I didn't know how to confront her, didn't know how to ask the questions that had been eating at me for so long. I was afraid of what she might say, afraid of hearing the words that would confirm my worst fears. But the not knowing was almost worse. It was like a slow, steady drip of poison, seeping into every corner of my mind and heart. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't enjoy the things that used to bring me comfort. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next shoe to drop. One night, as I sat alone on the couch, staring at the flickering light of the TV, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. The man I used to be, the one who worked tirelessly to support her, who believed in her dreams, who thought love could conquer anything, was gone. He'd been replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone bitter, broken, and lost. I hated what I'd become, but I didn't know how to fix it. The woman I loved had become a stranger, and I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I needed answers. I needed the truth. But most of all, I needed to find a way back to myself, before I lost everything. After weeks of tension and avoidance, I knew I couldn't keep sidestepping the issue. The more I tried to ignore the growing distance between us, the worse it got. Every small interaction felt rehearsed, like we were just two actors playing a role we'd long since grown tired of. I caught myself watching her out of the corner of my eye, hoping for some sign that the woman I'd fallen in love with was still in there somewhere. But the truth was hard to deny. She wasn't the same, and neither was I. I had to do something, no matter how much it hurt or how difficult it might be. One evening, after another long day at work, I walked in and found her sitting at the kitchen table. She was surrounded by her textbooks and notes, her laptop open and glowing softly under the dim light. It was a familiar scene, one that had once filled me with a sense of purpose. I used to look at her like that and think, this is why I'm doing all of this. I would tell myself that every double shift, every sleepless night, was worth it because I was helping her chase her dream. But now, as I stood there, it felt different. Hollow. I took a deep breath and sat down across from her. "Alara," I started, my voice softer than I'd intended. "We need to talk." She looked up from her notes, her eyes tired but guarded. "What is it?" she asked, not unkindly, but not warmly either. I hesitated, unsure of how to begin. I feel like... I trailed off, searching for the right words. "I feel like we've been drifting apart. I don't know if it's the stress from school or something else, but I'm just busy, Luca," she interrupted, her tone sharper now. "You know how hard this program is. I barely have time to think, let alone..." "I know you're busy," I said, cutting her off this time. I felt my hands clenching into fists under the table, and I had to force myself to relax. "I'm not blaming you for that. I feel like we don't talk anymore. I don't even know what's going on in your life half the time. I don't know where you're going at night, who you're with. I told you. It's just study groups," she said quickly, too quickly. Her eyes darted back to her laptop. "I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this." "Because it is a big deal," I said, my voice rising slightly. "You don't even look at me when you come home. You don't tell me anything anymore. Do you even, I stopped myself, swallowing the words before they came out. Do you even love me anymore? I couldn't say it. I was too scared of the answer. She let out a long sigh and closed her laptop. Luca, I don't have time for this. I'm trying to build a future for us, but I can't do that if you're constantly questioning me. For us? I repeated, my voice bitter. Is that what this is? Because it doesn't feel like it's about us anymore. It feels like it's just about you. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time in a long time, I saw anger in her expression. You don't understand what I'm going through, she snapped. You have no idea how much pressure I'm under. I can't deal with your insecurities on top of everything else. Her words hit me like a slap. I leaned back in my chair, my chest tight, my mind racing. Insecurities? That's what she thought this was? After everything I'd done, everything I'd given up, she thought I was just being insecure? I wanted to yell, to tell her that I wasn't imagining things, that I had seen the messages. Seen the way she smiled at someone else, the way she laughed so easily with him. But I couldn't get the words out. Instead, I just sat there, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I'm going to bed, she said finally, standing up and gathering her things. We can talk about this later, when you've calmed down. And just like that, she walked away, leaving me alone in the dim light of the kitchen. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. I thought back to the early days, when we were both so full of hope, so certain that our love could get us through anything. I thought about the nights we spent dreaming about the future, the mornings we woke up tangled together, laughing and making plans. And now it felt like all of that had been a different life. A life I wasn't sure I'd ever get back. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake on the couch, my mind replaying our conversation over and over. I kept trying to convince myself that it was just the stress, that once she graduated, things would go back to normal. But the doubt was always there, a nagging voice in the back of my mind that wouldn't let me rest. I thought about the messages again, the cafe, the way she looked at him. No matter how much I wanted to believe her, the evidence was right there. And yet, I still couldn't bring myself to confront her outright. Not yet. Not until I was sure I could handle whatever truth she had to offer. The next morning, I got up early and left the apartment before she woke. I needed space. I needed time to think. I drove aimlessly around the city, the sun just starting to rise over the rooftops, casting a warm, golden light that felt at odds with the cold knot in my chest. I found myself at a coffee shop we used to go to together, a small, cozy place tucked away on a quiet street. I ordered a cup of black coffee and sat at a corner table, staring out the window as people walked by, their lives seemingly so simple and carefree. I envied them. I envied their normalcy, their peace. I didn't know what my next move was. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this, doubting her, doubting myself, questioning every word she said, every move she made. I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe in her again. But trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. And love, no matter how deep, can't survive without it. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a void I didn't want to face. But I also knew that if I didn't take a step, if I didn't do something, our relationship would fall apart completely. I sat in that coffee shop for hours, nursing my coffee until it went cold, watching the world go by. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel the weight of everything, the fear, the anger, the sadness. I let it all wash over me. And when I finally stood up to leave, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't keep running from the truth. It was time to face it, no matter what that meant. That night, everything came to a head. The weight of the weeks of suspicion, the late-night arguments, and the lies I'd convinced myself weren't real finally became too much to bear. I was sitting at the kitchen table again, my hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee that I'd long since stopped drinking. When she walked in, she looked tired, more than tired, really. She looked worn down, like the very effort of standing there was more than she could handle. But I wasn't in the mood to feel sorry for her. Not after everything. Luca, she started, her voice soft but firm. We need to talk. I set the mug down slowly, my heart pounding against my ribcage like a drum. Sure, I said evenly, though I could feel the tension creeping into my voice. Let's talk. She hesitated, glancing down at the floor before meeting my eyes. I know you've been feeling distant. And I know it's partly my fault. I've been so focused on school, on trying to get through this program, that You lied to me, I said, cutting her off. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't regret them. I wasn't going to let her dance around the truth any longer. You told me you were studying at the library, but you weren't. I followed you, Alara. I saw you with him. Her face drained of color, and for a moment, she just stood there, silent. The room felt impossibly still, like even the air had stopped moving. You followed me? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I had to, I said, my voice rising. You weren't telling me the truth. You haven't been honest with me in months. What was I supposed to do? Just keep pretending everything's fine while you sneak around behind my back. It's not what you think, she said quickly, stepping closer. Luca, you have to believe me. Then tell me what it is, I said, my voice almost breaking. Because from where I'm sitting, it sure looks like you've been lying to me. It looks like you've been spending time with someone else, and you didn't think I'd find out. I didn't want to hurt you, she said, her voice trembling now. I didn't know how to explain it without making things worse. I was under so much pressure, and he was someone I could talk to. Someone who understood what I was going through. That's not an excuse, I snapped, standing up so abruptly that the chair scraped against the floor. You don't get to justify this by saying you were stressed. I was there for you. I've always been there for you. You could have come to me, but instead, you went to him. What does that say about us, Alara? What does that say about everything we've built together? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel any sympathy. I was too angry, too hurt. It wasn't about replacing you, she said quietly. It was never about that. Then what was it about? I demanded. Because right now, it feels like I was just some convenient fallback. Someone to pay the bills, someone to support you while you went after your dreams. Was I ever more than that to you? She didn't answer. The silence was deafening, and in that silence, I heard everything I needed to hear. She could have said anything to reassure me, to tell me that I'd been more than just a stepping stone. But she didn't. She just stood there, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her shoulders shaking. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. You should have told me, I said, my voice quieter now but no less firm. You owed me that much, at least. I know, she whispered. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. I didn't mean to, but you did, I said, cutting her off again. You did hurt me, Alara. And you don't get to just say you didn't mean to, and expect everything to be okay. I gave everything for you. I worked myself to the bone, sacrificed my time, my energy, my health, so you could have the future you wanted. And this is how you repay me? Her tears were flowing freely now, but I couldn't stop. The words poured out of me, years of frustration and doubt, and pain boiling to the surface. You were supposed to be my partner, I said, my voice shaking. My equal. We were supposed to be building a life together. But instead, you left me behind. You shut me out, and then you turned to someone else. How am I supposed to come back from that? I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know what else to say. I shook my head, turning away from her. Sorry isn't enough, I said quietly. Not anymore. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I stood there, staring out the kitchen window at the dark cityscape beyond, my mind racing. I wanted to forgive her. I wanted to believe that we could somehow fix this. But deep down, I knew that no amount of apologies could erase what she'd done. The trust was broken, and without trust, what did we have left? When I finally turned back to her, she was still standing there, tears streaming down her face. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and for a brief moment, I almost caved. I almost told her that we could find a way to move past this. But then I thought about all the nights I'd spent alone, wondering where she was. I thought about the messages I'd seen, the laughter I'd heard when she was with him. And I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay when it wasn't. I think you should go, I said finally, my voice hollow. Her eyes widened in shock. What? Luca. No. Please, I said, holding up a hand. I need time. I need space. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that this didn't happen. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. She just stood there for a moment, staring at me, before finally nodding. Okay, she whispered. If that's what you need. She grabbed her bag and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the quiet apartment. I stood there for a long time after she left. The sound of the door closing still echoing in my ears. I felt like I'd just run a marathon. Like I'd been drained of every ounce of strength I had. I knew I'd made the right decision, but that didn't make it hurt any less. As I sat back down at the table, staring at the cold cup of coffee I'd abandoned hours ago, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I was angry, hurt, betrayed, but I was also relieved. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have to wonder where she was or what she was doing. I didn't have to second guess her words or read between the lines. I didn't have to carry the weight of her secrets anymore. And in that moment, as painful as it was, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could start to move on. The night she left, I stayed up until dawn, sitting alone in the apartment that now felt more like a stranger's home than my own. Every shadow on the walls seemed to whisper her name. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me of her footsteps. My mind wouldn't let me rest. Over and over, I replayed the moment I told her to go, the look on her face, the way she hesitated at the door before walking out. I should have felt relief. After all, I was the one who asked for space. But there was no relief, only an emptiness that settled into my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I remember sitting there at the kitchen table, the light above me flickering slightly, casting an uneven glow. The apartment felt so quiet, it was almost oppressive. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside, but it all felt muted. My thoughts drowned out everything else. This was the moment I had feared, the one I had tried to avoid for weeks, maybe months. And now that it was here, I didn't know what to do. I wanted to get up, to do something, anything, but my legs wouldn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door as if expecting her to walk back through it, to say she'd changed her mind, that she wanted to fix things. But I knew better. That wasn't going to happen. As the hours passed, the apartment began to change. Without her presence, it seemed bigger, colder. The walls seemed farther apart, the furniture less inviting. I looked around at the space we had built together, remembering how we used to laugh while rearranging the furniture. How she'd pick out throw pillows, and complain that they never matched the couch. Those memories felt like a different lifetime. The warmth we once shared had been replaced by something else, something heavy and silent and filled with questions that had no answers. At some point, I moved to the couch, sinking into the cushions that had once been a place of comfort. I stared at the dark TV screen, seeing my own reflection staring back. My face looked pale, tired, older somehow. I thought about how much I had changed since we first met. Back then, I was hopeful, confident, sure that love would be enough. I believed that as long as we had each other, we could get through anything. But now, sitting alone in the quiet of that apartment, I wasn't so sure. I had given her everything, my time, my support, my trust, and it still hadn't been enough. I reached for my phone, scrolling mindlessly through messages and missed calls. Milo had texted me earlier, asking if I wanted to grab a beer. I hadn't responded. I couldn't face him yet. Couldn't explain what had happened. I knew he'd just tell me I was better off without her, that I deserved more. Maybe he was right, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like I'd lost something I could never get back. The hours dragged on, and eventually, the first light of dawn crept in through the blinds. I got up and made a pot of coffee, the familiar smell filling the air, though it didn't bring the comfort it usually did. I sat back down at the table with a fresh cup, staring out the window at the city waking up. People were going about their lives, heading to work, walking their dogs, starting their day as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed for me. I couldn't help but wonder if she was out there somewhere, thinking about me, about us. Was she regretting her decision? Or was she already moving on, leaving me behind just like she left the apartment? I knew I had to face the day at some point, to go to work, to keep moving forward. But how do you move forward when it feels like the ground beneath you has disappeared? Every step felt uncertain, every decision filled with doubt. I kept hearing her voice in my head, the way she said, "She didn't mean to hurt me." The way she said she didn't know how to fix things. But words weren't enough. Apologies couldn't undo the lies, the distance, the way she had turned to someone else when things got hard. I needed more than words. I needed actions. Proof that she still cared. That she still wanted the life we had built together. But she was gone, and all I had were the echoes of what we used to be. I thought about calling her. About asking her to come back so we could talk one more time. But what would that accomplish? I had already asked her to leave, to give me the space I thought I needed. Bringing her back now would just reopen wounds that hadn't even started to heal. I had to let her go. I had to let this go. But how? How do you let go of someone who has been your whole world for so long? How do you wake up and face the day when the person you built your life around isn't there anymore? As the sun rose higher, I realized I had no choice. I had to keep moving, keep living, even if it felt impossible. I couldn't stay in that apartment forever, drowning in memories and what-ifs. I had to start somewhere. Even if it was just getting up, getting dressed, and walking out the door. I couldn't let her absence define me. I couldn't let this break me. But as I stood there, looking around the apartment one last time, I felt the weight of it all pressed down on me again. She was gone, and I was still here, trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only thing I could do. I had to keep going, one step at a time. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had hit a turning point. One I'd never wanted but now had no choice but to confront. Each morning felt like waking up in a different world. The familiar patterns of my old life were gone. She wasn't there anymore, and with her absence came a strange clarity. At first, I fought against it. I tried to fill the silence with work, with errands, with anything that would keep my mind from drifting back to what I'd lost. But no matter what I did, it was always there, lurking in the background. The quiet had a way of forcing me to face the truth. One evening, I found myself back at that same kitchen table where everything had fallen apart. The apartment was still mine, technically, but it didn't feel that way. Her presence was in every corner, the books on the shelf. The faint trace of her perfume that lingered in the air. The coffee mug she always used still sitting in the cabinet. I could have packed it all away, boxed it up and sent it off, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I just sat there, staring at the table, the weight of what happened pressing down on me. It was then that I realized I couldn't keep running from it. I had to make a decision about how to move forward. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Milo's name was near the top. He'd called a few times since that night, and I hadn't answered. I didn't know what to say to him. Milo wasn't one for subtlety. He'd tell me outright that she wasn't worth it, that I needed to let go and move on. A big part of me didn't want to hear it, but I couldn't keep avoiding him. So I pressed call and waited. He answered on the second ring. "Luca," he said, his voice steady, like he'd been expecting my call. "It's about time." I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. "Yeah, I know. Sorry I've been out of touch." "You don't have to apologize, man. I get it. It's been rough." "Rough doesn't even begin to cover it," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. Milo was quiet for a moment, then asked, "You ready to talk about it?" I hesitated, then nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah, I think I am." Over the next hour, I told him everything. I laid it all out, the lies, the nights I couldn't sleep, the way she looked at me that final night. It felt strange saying it all out loud, like I was finally admitting to myself just how bad things had gotten. Milo didn't interrupt. He just listened. And when I was done, he said exactly what I knew he would. "Luca, you've been killing yourself trying to hold on to something that wasn't real anymore. You did everything you could. More than anyone else would have done. But now you've got to take care of yourself." "I know," I said, and for the first time, I meant it. "I just don't know where to start." "You've already started," Milo said. "You called me. That's a good first step." We talked for a while longer, and by the time I hung up, I felt a little lighter. Not fixed, not healed, but lighter. Milo had a way of cutting through the noise and getting to the heart of things. I needed that. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this. The next day, I went to the gym for the first time in months. It wasn't much, just a quick workout, but it felt good to move, to do something for myself. Afterward, I grabbed a coffee at a small cafe I used to go to before everything got so complicated. I sat by the window, sipping my coffee, and watched people walking by. They looked so ordinary, so normal. I wondered if any of them were carrying the same kind of weight I was. I realized then that life doesn't stop for heartbreak. The world keeps turning, people keep moving, and sooner or later, you have to find a way to keep moving too. Over the next few weeks, I started putting my life back together, piece by piece. I packed up her things and set them aside, clearing out the physical reminders of what we'd shared. I started cooking again, real meals, not just takeout. I picked up a few books I'd been meaning to read, and I actually finished them. I reached out to friends I hadn't seen in ages. They welcomed me back without question, like no time had passed. It felt good to reconnect, to laugh again, even if it was only for a little while. There were still hard days, of course. Sometimes I'd wake up and feel the weight of it all pressing down on me again. I'd wonder if I'd done the right thing, if I should have tried harder, if I'd ever really be okay. But those moments started to come less frequently. And when they did, I reminded myself of what Milo said. I'd done everything I could. The rest was out of my hands. One night, a few months after she left, I found myself sitting on the balcony of my apartment. The air was cool, the city lights stretching out in front of me. I thought about the man I'd been before all of this, the one who believed love was enough to fix anything, who thought hard work and sacrifice would always be rewarded. I wasn't that man anymore. I'd learned the hard way that love isn't always enough, and that sometimes, no matter how much you give, it won't be returned. It was a painful lesson, but it was one I needed to learn. As I sat there, watching the cars pass below, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't completely healed, and I knew there would always be a part of me that carried this experience with me. But I also knew that I was stronger now. I'd faced the truth, I'd let go of something that was holding me back, and I'd started to build a life that was mine. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was real, and it was mine. And that was enough. And just when you think it's over, there's one final twist. I took the pain, the betrayal, and turned it into something they never saw coming. How far would you go to reclaim your power? Comment below if you saw this ending coming, or if it took you by surprise. Let me know what would you have done. I've learned that in life, we must value ourselves and our worth above all else. Relationships, work, or any ambition can't come at the expense of self-respect and happiness. When we give everything without expecting respect, we lose more than we gain. It's important to set boundaries, to know when to walk away, and to remember that our future is ours to build, not dependent on anyone else. By doing so, we create a society where individuals thrive, lifting each other up with integrity and mutual respect. We owe it to ourselves, and to our community, to live authentically, and with dignity.